Ahoy all! So, I've been fairly busy with college, but hopefully I'll be able to crank out some discussion videos in this sort of video format while I procrastinate on putting together my footage from Wales, including the Talyllyn Railway and a footplate ride on the Talyllyn Railway with Douglas, as well as some pictures of Reverend Wilbert's study, which, I got to go inside. I don't know if I'm allowed to tell you that, but I got to go inside. And I have all kinds of other interesting pictures of the Welsh Highland Heritage Railway and some interesting videos of the other things I saw in Wales, but it's another video. So, in this particular video, we'll be discussing which geared steam locomotive type is the best. So I've heard many people claim out there that there's one particular type of geared steam locomotive that surpasses the other ones, and I don't think it's necessarily possible for anything fundamentally to be better than anything else, conceptually, because there's always going to be some circumstance where one thing that's supposedly better actually isn't, and vice versa. Everything's good, and that's fine. But, anyways, I still think it'd be fun if we at least tried to rank the geared steam locomotives in order. Doesn't necessarily mean that I prefer one or the other. It's just, practically speaking, which one is the best. So, the history of geared steam locomotives gets kind of confusing, and some of my information might not be entirely accurate, partly due to conflicting research and also due to the fact that a lot of the design specifications for geared steam locomotives revolve around patents, and from there it gets very, very muddled and confusing, because a lot of this wasn't very well documented. So, what exactly do I mean when I say geared steam locomotive? Well, for those of you who aren't aware, steam locomotives, conventional ones, are driven with a big pair of cylinders that turn the wheels via direct drive connecting rods. This has pretty much been the case since the locomotion number 1 first crawled around, and usually steam locomotives are driven in this manner. However, in some particular cases, such as logging railroads and places where the track is temporarily laid, and laid very poorly, it's better to have a locomotive that's driven via gears that can distribute its pulling power to all of the wheels, and also distribute its weight a lot better this way. Unfortunately, this tends to make them a lot slower because of the reduction gearing, and so they're usually used for very specific, specialized industrial purposes. Now, because it's based around patents, and all you have to do to get a geared locomotive patent different from somebody else's is to have gears arranged in a different manner, there's all kinds of different types of geared locomotives that we'll have to go through. So let's begin. So, technically speaking, geared locomotives actually predate conventional locomotives. The first geared locomotive came around in 1802 as the Coalbrookdale engine. And, so we're not going to be talking about very early examples in this video. We're going to be talking about engines that came around specifically to be reduction gear driven to get over difficult terrain. First of these is arguably the Climax locomotive. So, the Climax locomotive comes from the inventor Charles D. Scott, who developed the concept of what we know today as the Climax. In essence, a Climax has a boiler, which is mounted onto a frame with swiveling bogies, like a freight car, and the drive is provided by a pair of steam cylinders that are usually canted so that they can drive underneath the boiler, and from here, the steam cylinders drive a shaft, much like a car or truck, that powers all of the wheels through flexible joints. However, when this design came about, there was some contention over it. Another engineer, called Gilbert, proposed that the Climax locomotive should have a pair of marine-type engines driving into a multi-speed gearbox and a set of differentials on each axle on the shaft itself. This was pretty incredible thinking for the time, as in more recent times, some newer light rail vehicles, like airport trams and so on, tend to actually use his non-rigid axles to get around tight corners. However, for the time, this would have been a very mechanically complex locomotive, and it would have been a pain to oil. And so, my thinking is that he should have waited until Monster Jam was invented before trying this out on his locomotives. This patent did not eventually become the Climax locomotive. It was just a pitch, so to say, although the documentation on that one's kind of weird. But anyways, that didn't really go anywhere. Another engineer, though, this time named Battles, proposed another geared locomotive that actually looks a little familiar. Needless to say, Charles Scott took this guy to court and won because Battles' drawings still said Climax on them. And, yeah. If you're gonna copy his homework, I mean, come on. So, how well did the Climax locomotives perform? Well, we haven't gone over the context of other geared locomotives yet, so this will need a little bit of extrapolation. The Climax locomotive, for what it was very effective. It wasn't as powerful as a Shay locomotive, which could have up to 3 cylinders, and it wasn't quite as fast as a Heisler locomotive, which had bigger wheels and less gearing. But for shifting reasonably heavy loads on stupidly tight track work, you could certainly do worse. All geared locomotives shake quite badly when they're working. It's just sort of how they are. However, each of them have different flavors of shaking. The kind of shaking you get on a Climax locomotive is more of a vigorous side-to-side stomping sort of motion, like it has a limp or it's in a bad temper. Next up is the Dunkirk locomotive. This is where the patents get even crazier and more confusing, as my searches for early Climax locomotives brought up a lot of pictures of these things instead. So the Dunkirk Engineering Works began producing locomotives to a Climax borrowed design before most of the other types that we will be looking at beginning in the 1880s, with some four-wheeled Model A examples. Their engines had the same flexible drive shaft transmission as the Climax locomotives. However, to distinguish them, the cylinders were mounted vertically in kind of weird positions. Usually they would be in the cab somewhere. So the cylinders would be keeping the overalls of the engine crew very nice and greasy, and whenever the cylinder drains would open, they would spray scalding water everywhere inside the cab. I don't think this worked very well, and I could understand if this was not a popular feature of the Dunkirk. Another interesting point about the Dunkirk is that they didn't actually make very many of these locomotives. From August 1882 to their closing in 1894, they produced a grand total of 50 Dunkirk locomotives. That was it, just 50. The patents for the Class A and B Dunkirks actually belonged to Gilbert. However, Climax actually sort of swindled the patents back from his brother, so they were no longer allowed to produce Climax locomotives, and I think they might have gotten sued for making Dunkirks too, so it's very sketchy and shaky there. Weirdly, for a company that made railway locomotives, there was no track at all anywhere in the Dunkirk factory. So usually locomotives, when they were bought new, they would come with a photograph showcasing the locomotive. This was a way of the customer making sure that none of the parts had been missing off the locomotive in transit. All of the pictures of the Dunkirk engines, though, showed them clearly sitting on wooden blocks instead of actually being on tracks, which, yeah, nice. There are none of these things in operation, at least no original ones. I do believe there's a few replicas, so I can't personally attest to how they move, because there's not many that move anymore. Up next is one of my personal favorites, though, the Heisler locomotive. Charles L. Heisler, who possessed a suitably killer mustache for a guy with a name like that, worked to improve the somewhat design of the Dunkirk locomotive by taking the cylinders of the Dunkirk and putting them outside the cab, thank goodness, to produce his own design. Dunkirk would actually accept this design, and they would begin producing them. They made exactly one Heisler before they went out of business. They just made one, and that was it. So for a while, this was the only Heisler locomotive in the world. Just that one. Then, the Stearns Manufacturing Company began making Heislers for a little while, until Heisler eventually set up his very own locomotive works, the aptly named Heisler Locomotive Works. So, much like the Climax Locomotive Works, they were building their own patent locomotives at their own factory. Here, the production really took off, and many of the refinements were made to make these Heislers better than ever, such as enclosed cabs and fancy, newfangled electric lights. Heisler would then go on to build a lot of fireless locomotives after the logging industry stopped showing interest in having locomotives in general. And the last Heisler locomotive, as in the geared ones, was built for New Zealand in the late 1940s, and it's this funky looking thing. Totally unrelated though, Heisler also worked on a device for synchronizing sound recordings with film, and he's partially responsible for synchronized sound films, although the patents for those get even more confusing and crazy than geared locomotives. So what makes a Heisler a Heisler? Well, a Heisler makes use of a drive shaft which is powered by a V-shaped two-cylinder engine under the boiler. This engine powers a drive shaft that runs through the middle of the locomotive, much like the Dunkirk and the Climax, and then the drive shaft goes down to flexible bogies through an oil bath which only powered one axle in each bogie. So there's fewer gears than, say, on a Dunkirk or a Climax. The power is then driven via rods to the outside wheels, and from there, the power is transmitted. The big advantage of this, as I mentioned, was because the gears are only driving half the wheels, all the gears are enclosed to keep the dust and dirt out, the gears on a Heisler last a lot longer than on the other geared types. As well as this, because there are fewer gears and there's less friction in the overall system, and also the oiling points are a lot easier, a Heisler locomotive can go much faster than a typical Climax, Shay, or whatever. And this is pretty incredible. Some of these Heisler locomotives were actually rumored to reach speeds of up to 20 miles an hour. Now, 20 is about 10 miles an hour more than 10, so it's a pretty respectable speed if you ask me. Unfortunately, as a lot of the other geared locomotives started to get bigger, usually by adding another bogie under the tender, the Heisler locomotives were sort of designed with that as an afterthought. And because Climax technically owned a patent for having the shaft go between the back of the locomotive and into the tender, in the way that it did, the Heisler locomotive has this really weird sort of arrangement because it doesn't directly connect to the main shaft, and it has like its own little shaft that just connects to the tender. It's really weird. I couldn't find any good diagrams for it, and I don't understand it myself. Anyways, so how does a how does a Heisler locomotive perform? So, Heisler locomotives have a lot more speed than the other geared locomotive types, which actually makes them more useful in different industrial settings where you might want to go a little bit faster. In addition to this, the Heisler locomotives have a much different sort of shaking than the other types. The Heisler's flavor of shaking is more like a washing machine that's got a brick or some sort of other imbalance in, because the cylinders are a lot closer to the cab and they sort of thrash around, and they want to make sure that you're awake with these things. So, the next geared locomotive, the Shay. This one's everybody's favorite. Everybody likes the Shay. I like the Shay. You probably like the Shay. People in Taiwan like the Shay. People in Brazil like the Shay. Everybody likes the Shay. So, these were designed by a guy in Michigan called Ephraim Shay, who was a lumberjack and a school teacher and a locomotive designer and an inventor. Pretty interesting set of titles there. In 1875, he played around with a 3-foot wide, 5-foot tall boiler that he'd gotten for home heating or something, and he mounted this boiler onto a flat car of his 2-foot, 2-inch gauge railroad that he used for transporting logs. Fun fact, so, I don't know if you guys know this, but the Talyllyn Railway in Wales is 2-foot, 3-inch gauge, and so is the Corus Railway. And in theory, if they wanted to build a replica of a Shay locomotive, in theory there was one that ran on almost that exact track gauge. So all I'm saying is that if they wanted a replica of Ephraim Shay's Shay, it would actually work on their track. And I'm just saying that I think that'd be kind of cool. Anyways, so, as he toyed around with this little steam locomotive, by 1881 he had come up with a general patent for a gear-driven locomotive. Now the thing is, Dunkirk was producing geared locomotives at this point already, and I believe Climax was too. So you can't, with Shay coming along and patenting the entire idea of geared things in general, they went to court over that. Much like with a lot of film production groups at the time, which would, copyright the entire concept of making films. Anyways, so exclusive rights for building these locomotives went to the Lima Locomotive Works after they got their legal work sorted out. And a personal side note to this, Lima Locomotive Works is pronounced Lima. Lima is in Peru, and Lima is cooler than Lima, Ohio. And so, there's a difference. There's a difference in pronunciation. They're different places. With that being said, though, Rio Grande, Ohio doesn't deserve its own special pronunciation because unlike Lima, they didn't build any cool stuff. Okay, tangent over. Let's get back to the Shay locomotive. So, with Lima now owning the rights to build these locomotives, they began to build them in very large numbers, and they sold quite well. They were sold to a lot of different countries as well, and there's actually quite a number of them that are preserved outside the US, including a few on the Alishan Forest Railway in Taiwan. Now, what specifically makes a Shay a Shay? Well, a Shay works using a set of cylinders, usually 2 or 3, sort of in steamship sort of arrangement, on the right-hand side of the locomotive. They run a drive shaft that's actually mounted on the outside of the locomotive, so you can actually see all the gears on the one side, and it doesn't run through the center like the Climax, the Dunkirk, and the Heisler. The gears are more exposed on the outside, and as a result, the boiler has to be shifted over to the other side, and so the whole thing is a little bit crooked, but they're pretty interesting looking. The ride quality on these engines, I've been in several myself, they are very slow locomotives, but they produce the most power in terms of torque and in terms of actual steam cylinder type power because they have more cylinders. However, the ride quality, as a result, is actually quite odd because they tend to wobble side to side. This is because inherently they are asymmetrical and the motion of the cylinders going up and down is only on the right-hand side, and the suspension is also kind of less sensitive because of that, because the weight on the right-hand side is a little bit not quite the same as the other side, and so they're kind of weird, but at the same time, they're not going fast enough for you to really feel too much of that. And because of their greater pulling power and equal flexibility of the other types, they are an ideal choice for a lot of extremely steep railways. And so because of that, they got exported to a lot of different countries, and these were actually the last type to be built. In fact, the last one was built in 1945. And in that production run, they did again build just one locomotive in 1945. Just one really big one. And that was it. Now we've talked about the Shay, we have to talk about the Willamette. I don't know how to pronounce that word. So, the history of these engines so far is usually the result of somebody having a patent for a geared locomotive, somebody else sort of stealing that patent and then adapting it into something different, and then the legal battle sort of doesn't happen. Whereas this time, it just sort of emphasizes that the patent system is a little bit, because, well, if you look at this thing, this actually is this is not a Shay, remind you. It's not actually a Shay. This is a Williamette. And if you're looking at it from almost any angle, you're probably thinking to yourself, "Oh, what makes it different from a Shay? How did Ephraim Shay and Lima not sue these people?" Well, you see, the Williamette has a trump card over the Shay. If you look at one of the cylinders, you see the cylinder on a Shay, usually the one closest to the cab, usually is facing the other way, right? Well, on the Williamette, the valve is on the other side, so they all face the same way, which makes it different. Yeah. And yeah, so in essence, the Williamette is just a knockoff Shay. There's nothing different enough to talk about, so that's going to be it for this one.
This little rat is guilty!
Oh, you thought the Williamette was the only one to copy a geared locomotive design that already existed? Oh boy, if only that were the case. The Baldwin Locomotive Works actually stooped to this level at one point after seeing their smaller competitor, Lima, cranking out those Shay locomotives that sold very well. Now, Baldwin was a big company. They'd been around for a while, and so they weren't threatened by a dinky little workshop like Dunkirk, Climax, or Heisler making geared stuff. But when a company like Lima started making them, they felt a little bit threatened. So, nearly every other Baldwin locomotive at this point had a fairly conventional sort of design. They'd been traditional steam locomotives, and because of that, they'd sold very, very well. And, when they made geared locomotives, they didn't really know what they were doing, and they made 5 units, and of those 5, only 4 of them were ever sold. And, let's talk about these individually. So, this bootleg Climax here is nearly identical to the real Climax. However, some of the castings are differently shaped, and the editor of this picture actually masked off the drive shaft to hide the similarities to the Climax locomotive. The knockoff Shay here is interesting because, unlike the regular Shay, it actually is symmetrical. The boiler's in the middle, because the pistons are underneath the rest of it. Which, I don't like looking at that. How do you oil anything there? Do you need to take it over a pit? How are these lumberjacks or coal miners or whatever gonna get under there? It doesn't make sense. I'm seeing why they didn't sell that one. So, contrary to popular belief, the Americans were not the only people to produce geared locomotives. However, this one is more by coincidence rather than intentional design per se. These were built by Aveling and Porter of Rochester, which are famous for building steamrollers. And they've built more steamrollers than anybody's ever needed. In fact, if you're looking at any steamroller, most likely it's one of these. So, when they wanted to build locomotives, they tried to use as many standard traction engine / steamroller components as possible. And so because of that, these pretty much are just traction engines with the steering chains taken off and the wheels flattened a little bit. So these locomotives weigh very little compared to other ones. They're pretty easy to operate with just one guy, and they're pretty portable because they don't weigh very much. However, much like road-going traction engines, they are pretty slow, and most of these only had one cylinder, so they could use a little bit of a push to get going, and sometimes they would get stuck. Another thing that these would also have, just like the road-going steam engines, is a lack of suspension because the gears are very much directly meshing with each other. And so, yeah. Ride quality here really isn't much of a question, though, as regular traction engines shake pretty much at any speed, sort of a back-and-forth type of shake, and so I guess these would do the same. Of course, all of the above is just technical critique, and these things look very Victorian, and I would love to own one of these things, even if they're a little bit less than useful outside of stuff like the Brill tramway. But, they're just cute looking. I want one. So this next category is geared locomotives from New Zealand. So New Zealand had a lot of forest railways. They were usually called bush railways. However, like the ones in Taiwan, which used the Shay locomotives, like the Alishan Forest Railway, the New Zealanders made a lot of these ones themselves. The results sort of speak for themselves. I don't doubt that they work, but, most of these don't fit into any particular category since they're really just bits of traction engines and steam winches chained to existing wagon wheels. However, in this godforsaken land of homeless traction engines, a hero did emerge amongst them, the Johnston 16-wheeler. Now, to cut it short, it's a Dunkirk. The shaft is scooted to one side, but basically, it's a Dunkirk. Though by the time these things came out, Dunkirk was long, long gone, so they wouldn't have really been in any legal trouble for producing these things. Partly because I don't think anybody else would want one. Like the very earliest American geared locomotives, some of these railways were actually using wooden rails. So instead of steel rails, they would use wood because they're already cutting down trees and so on, so it makes sense. And so the reason these have so many wheels is because they have to spread that weight on as much surface area as possible so that they don't break through. and so because of that, they have this very interesting sort of design. Personally, I would assume that the type of shaking these would have is closer to the Heisler, although I think it might be due more to the track conditions than anything else. Oh, and these people also made this cursed Climax that ran on Heisler trucks. And, so that's all the locomotives that we've got to talk about. There's probably other types of geared locomotives that I didn't have time to put on this list. So here's all of them ranked, from worst to best objectively, although I do love all of them. The bottom, New Zealand, no thank you. The Baldwin bootleg ones, these things are gross, I don't like looking at them. Above them is the Williamette, however you say it. It's not a Shay, but it's about the same. The one above that would probably be the Aveling and Porters, simply because if you're running a really, really lightweight railway, this is exactly what you need, but if you're running anything heavier, Now, just above that is the Johnston 16-wheeler, because the Johnston 16-wheeler is Chadley. It's good for really light railways, they're economical to make, and you don't need steel rail, which I think is kind of cool. The Dunkirk, which is a very old design that didn't really adapt, but they're essential for inspiring most of the later designs. The Climax locomotive is above that next in third, and they've been produced for a long time. They have lots of different variations, pretty good pulling power, and they look kind of cool. Now on the number 2 spot is my personal favorite, the Heisler. The mechanics are simple, they're easy to maintain, they're reliable, and they're pretty decently fast. Although the number 1, because people would yell at me if I didn't put this one at number 1, is the Shay locomotive. They're powerful, practical, and they sold the best out of all of them. And, yeah, pretty good things. So this is my first proper discussion type video. I will probably do more of these on random topics that I find interesting, because I need a captive audience to share these thoughts with, so thank you. Go watch my animations now. Okay, bye.